What can I do today?
Welcome to 21st Century Radio. I'm Dr. Zohara Hieronimus. Laura Kortner is our executive producer, and Anita Brockington, our engineer. And joining us as well, this portion of the program is someone I've interviewed over the years. Her name is Dr. Karen Shanor, and you've probably seen her on television, on the Oprah, or so many shows, and I'll tell you about those in a bit. But her co-authored book with Dr. Jagmeet Kanwal is a beautiful journey into the inner worlds of all creatures, great and small. And as our audience knows, one of my passions is the animal world. From the ant to the whale, she and her co-author show us just how brilliant nature and natural systems are. We will learn, as the title of their book suggests, that indeed, bats sing, mice giggle, The Surprising Science of Animals' Inner Lives, a Totem 2010 book. Dr. Shanor, thank you so much for rejoining our program.
I always love it, and thank you so much.
Well, you are a neuropsychologist, a former White House consultant, advisory member of Discovery Channel Global Education, and much more. But tell us how you first journeyed into this arena.
This is a book that I never expected. And then it went on from there. All of the information and what I really learned about the latest science of animals, I was just stunned. And I live here almost in Rock Creek Park. I live in the country. I was in Africa for a number of years. I spent time as a little girl living in the country. But this is so amazing that, and yet at another level, so it's not. It's something we all suspected, and certainly a lot of your listeners kind of know and intuit. But now it's science, because we have the technology, because we can pick up the frequencies of animals, and even in the quantum area show, for example, how birds and how bats and how other mammals can detect the magnetic lines of the Earth so that they can know which way to migrate and how to travel through a quantum effect called radical pair model. It goes from there to how animals play, why they wake up while they're hibernating right now to get a little bit of sleep every week, and it goes from there. Now, I was going to write a book with my colleague, Jagmeet Kanwal. He's my colleague at Georgetown University, and he, by the way, has been studying bats for over 12 years. Did you know that there are 50 bats in the basement of Georgetown University?
Well, that's better than the Belfry, I suppose. And it's his research.
Anyway, we had done, I've done a number of Smithsonian classes, and we did a seminar, an all-day seminar on the emotional brain. Mm-hmm. And we were then going to write a book on the emotional brain when this book took over, quite frankly.
Well, it's interesting because looking a little bit at his own laboratory research, which was on understanding animal origins of speech and music as sort of this audio-vocal communication in humans, as it says on the jacket of your book, Bats Sing and Mice Giggle. So when you two bring your great talents together, I mean, you've been a consultant for wildlife conservatories. You hosted an NBC program for 5 years. You're, as I mentioned, on Larry King Live, CBS Nightly News. I mean, you're everywhere. How did you two decide the frame of reference for, and it is an extraordinarily beautiful book, I'd like to say as well.
Thank you. It's just growing. The response to it, not only nationwide, because it came out here in September and sold out twice already.
Mm-hmm.
The response is basically people of all walks of life are responding because it's nature around us. It's what's really happening. But this is how it happened. It was a total shock. And right after we did our seminar on the emotional brain, that at the end of the seminar, our audience, a large audience at the Smithsonian, Jack then showed some pictures of his bats. And they're very emotional. Rocking their babies in their wings, squabbling over who's going to get to be next to whom. One bat whacked another bat off its perch, and remember, they're hanging upside down, so that's not easy to reorient. And I was watching the audience, and as you know, I'm a clinical psychologist as well. People were sitting on the edge of their seat, and it was as if, and the emotion on their face and their reaction to all of this, it was as if everything we had discussed that whole day, we had told them about the emotional brain, we had talked about humans, but then it came together for them. And I could see that. So the next day when I was walking in the park, And by the way, Jag said that there had just been research that showed that bats not only sing songs, they compose their own songs. And there was recent research that showed that mice giggle and rats laugh when you tickle them.
Or as you even point out, elephants can hear with their toes. And
yes,
I mean, we'll get to talking about some of the just amazing animal facts.
Came to me, and I was so taken by the title. The first time I've written a book around a title, usually that's the last thing, and I have to really dig and say, what am I going to call all of this? But there was the title, and it was so compelling. I wasn't supposed to call Jag for about a week and a half about our new book. We decided just to kind of think about things and pull it all together. And I couldn't wait. I called him about 4 days later. I said, Jag, this is the book we have to write, and this is why. And the funny part from his side, he was so stunned that it was as if he was in a trance. I was talking to him, and he sounded so strange. I'm thinking, what's going on here? And he said he was so stunned, but for both of us, it touched us so deeply.
Well, and I think
this was the book we had always thought, this is a subject area that was so deep and so important to each one of us, and suddenly it was time to do it. So I did 6 months of intense research, and it's cutting-edge science, and it's a mind-blower. It's the first book to show, for example, how not only that animals predict earthquakes, but how they do it and how they know to look at each other and check signs from each other to know something's happening. And as humans, we miss the whole thing.
When I was covering the war in Zagreb, Croatia, I remember talking about the zoo with the zookeeper there, who talked about the snakes aborting and animals aborting their young and attacking their young, and terrible, things happened before hours before the bombings came. So let's talk a little bit about that, because I used to report that about ants and things, that they would tell us long before an earthquake came. So what do you find out about animals sensing the changes within the earth before we see the visible signs?
There's so many things that go on. It can go on weeks and even months, but certainly weeks before the actual earthquake, that they can pick up on this information. By the way, we start the introduction to our book talking a quote from UP talking about the tsunami in 2004 that was so devastating. And the head of Yala National Park in Sri Lanka said, over 22,000 people have died. There are no dead animals.
Yeah, an extraordinary fact.
And that's what we start in the book. What do the animals know that humans do not heed or we're not aware of anymore that we need to tap back into and appreciate? Well, let me tell you, for an earthquake, a lot of things happen because I talked with several geologists and also Patrick Heelan, who was former president of Georgetown University, is not only a quantum physicist but a seismologist. He has several PhDs, and explained that in terms of the waves under the earth, there are different types there are deep waves under the earth, and there are more surface waves, if you will. And they pick up and create all sorts of things. For example, when there's an earthquake, the earth tilts a bit. Now, pigeons even can tell if the earth is starting to tilt. Many animals, of course, that live underground, like the moles and all of the underground, have to be aware of what's going on because they don't have the sun to give them direction, and they can feel it. The worms can feel it. The vibrations under the earth start very early on, and even electromagnetic and electrical changes. If two rocks hit each other, there's an electrical output that the animals pick up. Even changes in humidity. That's what's happening under our feet that we're not aware of, and some of our, certainly our technology picks up, but not enough of it. The animals know it, and when animals see worms rushing out of the ground and chipmunks rushing out of the ground, or elephants, as you mentioned, can pick up, actually they can pick up rumblings 200 miles away through their nose and through the tip of their toes. They know to check each other when the birds are squawking and the dogs are barking. they're telling each other something.
Well, and I thought
listen.
it was interesting that a number of things come to mind. Firstly, when I used to cover the Navy's underwater experiments, and I was always so stunned that they didn't regard this as tragic for the ocean creatures, and then all the whale beachings and things that were abnormal. When you look at this body of work that you and Dr. Kanwal have brought together in such a delightful telling, by the way. It doesn't read like an academic book. It's like a journey.
Well, I hope not.
No, it's delightful.
And
some of the stories are just delightful.
But vibrations are take a little longer to read, but the whole book is really for the average reader. In fact, I'm working with middle school students as well as all sorts of nature conservatories, because it's for all of us to read.
Well, what I was going to ask you was, given the fact that there is weather engineering and there is underground nuclear explosions and there are underoceanic tests, that these aren't just simply man doing things to man. We are upsetting a balance, and I think your work is going to go a long way to help understand it. So let's look at the book in general, because you've structured it beautifully, and you talk about this whole notion of echolocation, how animals, whether in the water or the air, actually use, as you started to point out, frequency as a method of communication, as do humans, by the way.
Yes, and you may have seen the film of a young man who is blind who would send out clicks, and which would bounce against something, and he could tell if there's a piece of furniture in front of him. So we can do that. We have just discarded or not paid attention to so many of our senses, and certainly the animals bring in their distinct senses, which is a sense of smell, or back to echolocations, how the bats echolocate. They not only echolocate to tell where they are, but they can tell what's around them and who's around them, and they can change their frequencies. All these high frequencies that we have never been able to hear with our own ears, we now have the technology to hear, even to hear that mice not only giggle, but in fact there was a mouse in Carmel Valley, California that was detected that sang a very melodic song. There are probably more than that, but there happened to be a scientist from North Carolina who had the bats and had dealt with bats and their frequency and had her technology out there and had picked that up. So now we are using technology to be able to sense things as humans at a much different level.
Well, I owned some rats when my daughter was young, and the frequency that they communicated on was different than ants, but similar. And I said to people, I now understand the reverence held for them by much of the Hindu tradition in the past, because they actually do communicate at a frequency that humans can hear when you tap in, and I was just surprised how heart-centered it was.
Well, and you have always been so aware and so sensitive and have shared this in so many ways in terms of who you are and through the media, that I was especially looking forward to my time in talking with you, because a lot of these things you already know and your listeners have been aware of or tapped into, and maybe have even said to somebody, and somebody said, oh, no, that doesn't happen. That's silly. Well, you know what? It's happening under our feet right now. It's dark and at night, but when they wake up, we have moles that communicate to each other. One mole hits his head against the tunnel, and another mole, football field away, puts his little jaw against the earth to pick up the actual very precise code that's being sent out.
You also pointed out that prairie dogs bark in different dialects, and you also share how birds will have different songs depending on what predator is around. If it's a coyote, it's one song. If it's a snake, it's another song.
Yes. Well, and we're finding more and more animals do that. And even if we just listen to the chickadees, for example, around us, you will listen, and chickadees add a D to their message if there's danger coming on. And they can add up to like chickadee, up to 23 have been counted, and whether it's a hawk coming or there's a snake down there or a human being is coming close, and maybe somebody they don't like, because we've also found that birds can recognize human faces. They can tell the difference between us. I can't tell the difference between most chickadees, quite frankly. And so they are very much, and they know which human beings, and we have this in research in prairie dogs, that we see it around us. They know the human being who is going to help them and someone they can count on, and they know the one who is dangerous.
Well, and I think all of us have experienced that in our own lives, and dogs certainly, because most people are more familiar with dogs and cats than probably most animals, at least from the wild, but people know what it means to smell fear, or even your own body changes when you're in fear.
Absolutely, yes. And they can pick up on it, and as you have mentioned, we can too. And whether it's ants that send out the pheromones of different emotions, which they do. They have a lot of different pheromones, and they communicate quite well with that, or whether it's a worm that is in stress that leaves a trail of mucus to let the other worms know that there is danger around. They're doing this all the time around us.
We have a worm rescue squad at our house every time it rains, and these poor, beautiful worms, we have lots of acreage, they come up and they drive themselves in droves for the driveway where the water is plentiful, and then the sun comes out and they start to dehydrate, so our job is to walk the whole driveway, and I have literally picked up hundreds of worms and put them into the garden. But
I love you.
Why? Well, I couldn't live with myself if I didn't, to be honest. I would think about it all day.
Whatever we can do to keep things going, but I'm not surprised to hear you say that, because that's who you are.
My mother used to yell at me, start swimming. I would spend all my time in the pool saving the bugs. We're good.
Well, they let each other know that you're okay.
They did. They go, rescue squad is here. I grew up thinking I'd be a paramedic, but I discovered there's blood involved. Saving insects wasn't quite like saving people. Our guest is Dr. Karen Shanor with co-author Jagmeet Kanwal, called Jag, right? Their beautiful totem book, 2010 release, Bat Sing, Mice Giggle, The Surprising Science of Animals' Inner Lives. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. I'm Dr. Zohara Hieronimus. Our guest is Dr. Karen Shanor, and with her co-author have produced a magnificent book entitled Bat Sing, Mice Giggle, The Surprising Science of Animals' Inner Lives. Again, a Totem Book 2010 release. Karen, I want to come back to some of the bigger things. There's so many particulars that we can probably spend most of the night doing those. But how about some of the big categories? For instance, one of your whole sections is on surviving and how animals do that. They have different methods for staying alive and preserving the colony or the flock or the den. Describe some of those for us.
And certainly sending out signals to each other, which we've already talked about. Letting each other know when there is danger, even playing tricks. There are, and they play all sorts of tricks, not only on us, not only on our, maybe on our cat who's trying to get a bird, and one jaybird gets the cat distracted or pulls the hair out of the cat, but they're very, very clever in terms of getting the predator or the enemy to look the wrong direction or to show up somewhere and they've already gone. So there's a great deal of cleverness and deception. And, of course, we talk about socializing later in the book, even in terms of how they try to deceive their rivals. One of the things, for example, we still have, there are the spring peeper frogs here in Rock Creek Park, for example, that when they hibernate, they basically freeze. They're freezed in little ice cubes.
It's the question all children want to know. What happens to all the animals in the pond when it freezes?
Yes, well, and that's what scientists and medical community wants to know, too. And we have quite a few of the secrets in the book that we're learning from them. One of the first things we're learning is when it's warm enough, and also the angle of the sun is very important, that little peeper frog, which is about the size of our fingernail, thaws out. First of all, its heart thaws out, and then its brain, and then its little legs, and it starts hopping around very quickly to find a mate. Now, when its heart thaws out, that it is as if it has rebooted its heart. So cardiologists are saying, how does this work?
Yeah.
How do we reboot a heart? How do we thaw out a brain? And how does this freezing, because generally freezing shrinks cells. Well, something interesting happens here because there's just a tiny bit of a type of antifreeze in each cell that keeps the cell from shrinking. So we're trying to find out, what is this? How can we use it medically? And we go on from there. We're studying brain waves. We're studying the electromagnetic connections that animals have with each other. We're finding out, for example, how do fireflies know how to synchronize, that suddenly their lights blink at the same time? What is that synchronization? How do ants and termites know how to build amazing communities? How do they communicate, and what we call self-organization, of chaos theory, complexity theory, that in fact information that's used in a local area, which then becomes useful and changes what happens in a larger area. And this is true for migrations. How do animals know when to migrate? And what?
And I'd like to ask you, because, and you do, and again, I really encourage our readers, if you've been looking and because you're interested in animal communication and believe in intelligence in the universe, not just in humans, but in all life, and I include the mineral, that's a whole other subject, and the plant, and that's another subject, but yes, indeed, in animal life.
About the plant in this book, too, the research on plants and the electrical signals that they give off, especially when they're in danger.
Well, you know, when you put it all together, we finally come to what the esoteric traditions have taught for millennium, which is that all life is vibration, and it's a question of wavelength.
And that's the reason. That's the reason for the book, quite frankly, and that's why it's so compelling. I don't say this to most people because most people don't have that level of appreciation and understanding that you and your listeners do. But that's basically, instead of walking out there and saying, save the animals, they're important too, I want to show everybody, this is really what's happening around you. How could we possibly, when we understand the amazing vibrations that are going on around us down to the quantum level, or up to the quantum level, if you will, how they are communicating, how could we possibly want to destroy something this not only amazing but sacred?
Well, and how do we give ourselves permission to experiment and torture animals? I mean, you want to talk about the misery that we're, reaping and that we're creating in the animal kingdom. But I think that what you have done is taken this whole field to the level that it needs to be, which is in the scientific community, because it's the scientific community that has used and abused animals, as well as the animal husbandry for food.
Well,
I mean, there are humane ways to do these things.
It was also the scientific community that up until about 20 or 30 years ago was saying, oh, these things don't happen. Was saying when we were researching African gray parrots in terms of what they're able to do, and I have a whole chapter on wits, wiles, and good fun in terms of the African grays, and certainly Alex, the African gray parrot of Pepperberg, Peggy Pepperberg. Basically, scientists were saying, this is ridiculous. They wouldn't fund it. And now it is the scientists who have the technology, who have the interest to set up experiments and spend a lot of their time really bringing to us that level of amazement and understanding now of the world around.
Yeah, and the reverence. I mean, for me, the holy reverence is coming back into the scientific community, which for so many decades was really industrially mechanized, at least from my vantage point. So
and it was, and that's because we are at classical physics, that we're at the level of things and things and molecules and the physical and experiments that could only get that information, and we're set up in that way. And the methodology, which was inhibiting. Now we have the technology. If somebody can receive a cell phone message, why can't we and the animals around us also receive messages in the waves around them, or even at a quantum level?
Well, and then I thought some of the work that animal DNA, as an example, can be changed in one generation by certain experiences, which tells us a lot, I think, about human DNA that is misunderstood.
Well, this book and the findings in this book has upended, not only this book, but certainly the science in the last year has upended so many of our premises, and one of them is DNA. And we thought, well, DNA is this map that we're born with, and our chromosomes and in our inheritance, and it's simply then our genes go out and tell our cells and our body parts what they're supposed to do, how they're supposed to grow. Doesn't work that way. Just like our brain cells change with every experience we have, every thought we have, we create new cells, new connections, we prune away old things that aren't used. Well, in fact, there is proof, more and more proof now, that as we have an experience, when something happens to us, and certainly in the animal world as well, when there is a change, there is actually a change in the chemistry of the DNA as well.
Exactly. My late dowsing teacher, Terry Ross, used to say that DNA is actually like a light switch. We can turn it on and off, and it's not
the way
static.
It goes. And even RNA, we used to think that was just a messenger molecule that went from the DNA and said, okay, cells, this is what you're supposed to do. Well, now they can interfere with things. Genes can turn on and off, depending on whether we need them or what use they are. It's very interactive with our environment and with our internal process. And that's why I tell my students, or whoever it is, every thought we have, every experience we have, changes not only the architecture of our brain, but changes our actual chemistry of our DNA.
Yeah, it really puts us somewhat in the driver's seat, which sometimes can be scary, but I say have compassion for yourself, and it doesn't have to be so frightening that we actually are affecting ourselves and the world around us with all thought, deed, and act. One of the, I thought, amazing things, back to something you had said earlier about bats and whales composing their own complex songs. What in this work really surprised you? I mean, there are so many surprises.
There were so many surprises. Actually, the mole telephone surprised me. And actually, in its own way, when I walk outside, it touched me deeply because there's a part about when the little moles go and they separate from their mothers and they have their own isolated tunnel. And that's the way generally they communicate the rest of their lives. And I'm thinking, they're right underneath my feet. Probably the chipmunks are doing the same thing. There's one bit of research that shows a spider, tiny little spider, gets on its tippy toes, and if it catches the right breeze, it can go up to 500 miles over the ocean and perhaps land on a boat or land on an island. They always wondered, how do these little spiders get here?
Yeah.
Well, because they're sailing along, a little balloon spider, a little kite spider, if you will. That was pretty exciting and something I had never thought of. There's so many things. The whales, how they do communicate miles and miles away, and also how they are there to pick up, as you had mentioned earlier, the vibrations around them. And if there is something, if somebody is in detriment or in danger in some way, how animals of all species come to help.
Well, when I was reading your excerpt on, it's titled Reducing Drag and Keeping Track of the Group, about geese and how they fly, I have always wondered why pilots don't fly like that.
Well, and I mentioned in the book, actually, which is a little scary to me, but we're talking about, for example, how actually pilots have, we've known in the Air Force, we're talking about when you see, let's say, geese migrating over us. Well, there's a goose in the front, and then two behind, and when you look at the V, it is not an exact V. It's a little off-center, and there's a reason for that, and that's so the birds can all see each other better. But the goose in front and then the two behind him or her are a little bit higher in height because they can pick up on the air that's given off the tumultuous spinning, and then the next ones are even higher. And then when the one in front gets tired, it goes to the back. Well, our Air Force and a number of Air Forces have used that. But what was interesting to me, because of the fuel problems and the cost of fuel, about 6 or 7 months ago, commercial airlines are looking into flying in that pattern as well. Now, that made me a little nervous. Because
that they'd be that close?
I'm not sure correctly in the air.
But it is so interesting because it does reduce drag. I was watching geese recently do that, and I thought, what a remarkable thing. I've often, and that's why the esoteric traditions are so wonderful around the world, and the native traditions worldwide throughout the millennium, is that the shamans and the witch doctors and the native peoples didn't lose the ability to communicate with the animal world and to replicate some of their wisdom teachings. I mean, the ants, they have burial grounds for the dead.
They have their cemeteries. They have hospitals for the sick ants. And, for example, if the food source changes, one ant will come back and set up signals in a certain way. And many of those signals are not just the pheromones, not just the vibrational odor that is given off, but in fact they're electrical signals to let the rest of the, I was going to say organism, because in fact, whether it's ants or bees, there is really, it's as if they're one, as if, and there's a wonderful book, by the way, by Dr. E.O. Wilson called Superorganisms. They let each other know, they communicate that constantly. And there are, as you mentioned, there are humans still in different parts of the world who are attuned to that. Each of us can become more attuned. Next time the crows come around, as they did around my house a couple of days ago, suddenly listening to what they're saying to each other, where they're going, and even mimicking some of the sounds and see what their reaction is, for us to participate, for us to try and not only appreciate, but more and more to understand and even involve ourselves in this surrounding amazement.
Well, you learn a lot. I mean, I used to joke that the crows always told me when there was a policeman on the road by the side. And I'm not kidding. If I saw a black crow, and I'm not joking, I'm telling you the absolute truth, they were letting me know that there was a speed trap ahead.
They're so smart, and of course they create their own tools to get food, and even on our website, batsingmicegiggle.com. And by the way, the book can be purchased in most bookstores as well as on Amazon.com. So it's like I said, it's sold out twice, and it is available again, and we're going to continue to put out many more copies. But yes, there are crows, for example, talking about their intelligence, carrion crows in Japan that stay there right at a stoplight, and when the cars stop, they put these nuts under the tires of the car, and then the cars roll on and crack the nuts for them, then they rush in and get the cracked nuts and eat them. So they plan ahead. There are amazing things that they do, and it's time for us not to think that we're the only intelligent ones around. In fact, many animals can count. Many animals can do math. We talk about that in the book as well.
Well, that was wonderful. Animals from bees to primates, as the summary says, can count, and many can do math. I didn't do math well. I should have learned from a primate or something.
They're doing many more things than we realize, so we might as well learn from a good bee or something like that.
We're going to take a little break, Dr. Shanor, and when we come back, we'll look at some of the other remarkable things in this beautiful book, Bats Sing, Mice Giggle, The Surprising Science of Animals' Inner Lives. It's co-author with Jagmeet Kanwal. It's a Totem Book 2010 release. You can learn more online. Go to Amazon.com. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. Our guest is Dr. Karen Shanor. Her co-authored book, Bats Sing, Mice Giggle, The Surprising Science of Animals' Inner Lives. You can find them online at Amazon.com, and their Totem book is being republished because it keeps selling out. I want to come to one of the issues that always moved me as a child, which was the animals that paired for life, whether it was the mourning dove or elephants, but you've done quite a bit of looking at that.
And, I certainly brought the research together because in the chapter on socializing and call it flirting, courting, and coupling, end up talking about the animals that, in fact, such as the albatross that lives up to 80 years of age, the royal albatross, they usually pair for life, and a special group of voles that are in Indiana, if you will, and there are different types of prairie voles. This is a special group, and it turns out that they are monogamous. And scientists such as Dr. Tom Insel, who is head of NIH at one point, wanted to know, what is it? It's because they have certain neurotransmitters that they have developed in their brain and an extra amount of oxytocin, which is that neurotransmitter and hormone of actual bonding, that the love we feel for our children or when we bond with something. And there are a number of things that happen. So we know that, in fact, there are not only chemicals that we're born with or we have at a certain stage in our lives, but we create through our experiences. And that's why I actually end the chapter, as we talk about all of the animals, end up with that research on what seems to be there for animals that are monogamous. And then I talk about human interaction, when the orgasm and what kind of chemicals that gives off, when we're feeling very close and bonding. And so we spend 2 paragraphs at the very end to show, as human beings, when we have a loving sexual experience, a loving experience with someone, how, in fact, those very chemicals are powerful. And they're powerful for our memory as well. So we remember that experience, and then we want to recreate it again. Once again, showing how we can choose positive experiences for ourselves, and then we can recreate them, and they are very strong in our memories, that we don't have to be controlled by everything around us, especially a lot of the negative aspects of sexuality and relationships that are around us or that we've lived in our own families. But in fact, we can, just as we have learned from these animals that are monogamous, that take care of each other, that reach out in their own way and stay together, that in fact we can utilize this very information, this very science, to create wonderful experiences for ourselves and recreate them again.
One of the paragraphs I circled on page 225 was, quote, "In most animal groups, the female often chooses the mating situation, and researchers have found that what a female bird may want in a mate can change from year to year." So I just had to laugh. I went, does that sound like life?
Because it depends on the year.
Well, there you go. A love in every season. You know, it changes. And I think when couples understand that about each other, the marriage survives. And when they expect it to be the same as when they were 24, 25, there's a lot of disappointments.
We're always growing. We're either growing or dying. And
I like that. That's pretty simple.
We have new experiences. And as there are different requirements around us, and this is what we find in the animal world, for example, perhaps it's a good idea for 1 year when there's a lot of food around for the male bird to have a long tail and be very bright in color. Perhaps in another year it's better for the male to have a shorter tail and not be as colorful. And the female senses what is best for the species and for the family, if you will, and chooses accordingly.
All of these teachings are remarkable, and I asked you earlier, what sort of impacted you, and you told us the story about the moles and those things just under us in our parks and in our homes in suburbia and elsewhere. In terms of the research, though, where would you like to see it go? Because, again, you've sort of cracked open my favorite writer on this years ago was the late J. Allen Boone, who wrote Kinship with All Life, and I'm sure you read that a long time ago. And he was sort of making the effort to remind everybody you can talk to ants and ants talk to you. And I used to share some stories about how I did that to get them out of my kitchen. But they like to talk all the time, by the way. So if you start a conversation with them, be ready to talk all the time.
And my husband swears that when we were Peace Corps volunteers in Somalia, that he made a contract with the cockroaches to only go so far in one room and to stay out of the other rooms. And he said, "Don't you remember I did that?" And
well, it's true. It does work. I mean, I used to joke but that as soon as you stop the communication and having reverence for it, they act like, all the town is theirs. But what are these things? I mean, the work that you've done, both in terms of communicating in the community to the world at large through regular apparatus like the Larry King Show or CBS or whatever, and the Smithsonian series. I mean, this is an opportunity that you bring to the general public that not all communicators have.
Well, it's awe-inspiring, and what I'm trying to do is say, this is what is out there. This is magnificent. Open our eyes, be aware of, learn more about, but most of all, interact with, revere, as you had said earlier. And for heaven's sake, science doesn't have to be boring. It's the most exciting thing there is. As we're getting more into quantum physics, I talk about entanglement in the book, and in terms of how there's close alignment in a lot of ways at many, many different levels. How a photon of sun, for example, can hit the right eye of a bird that's migrating, and suddenly they see the horizon turns purple. They see the magnetic lines of the Earth, and they know exactly which way to fly. Isn't that exciting? It's once again, truth is much more exciting and fascinating. And I hope I would like to share that with everybody, because I'm so excited about it, and following up on now seeing what is going on around us. But most of all, and by the way, you asked me what stirred me. There are also these birds called the mannequin birds, where the older male teaches the younger male to do a dance. So they do a song and dance to impress the females. Now, male A, at the end of the courting season, the older male is the only one that gets the female. The apprentice has to wait. And sometimes the apprentice waits for 5 to 20 years until the older male retires, and then he can teach other males. But can you imagine singing and dancing, and then you don't get the girl that year?
Gee, it sounds like the traditions of most spiritual lineages, actually. You serve your teacher for a decade or two, and the service is the rendering of the learning, and
That's
then
right.
you get to teach. I mean, it's pretty traditional, actually.
And they know the rules, and they know exactly what to do, and they work so hard at it. It's wonderful.
Well, and there were things, I remember the late Robert Becker, I don't think he's still living, who first started working on the regeneration of limbs by watching salamanders, and was telling the community back in the 80s that through electromagnetic healing we can probably regenerate limbs.
Absolutely. And we show in the book, we have our first chapter after the introduction is called Supercharge. And we talk about the electric and the electromagnetic interaction. And we also talk about, certainly with salamanders, actually they have found now that salamanders can regenerate half of their bodies. And so we're using this, so how can we do this? And I was just talking with a scientist this morning about how we are starting to look at this regeneration. In fact, it's been shown, and this was years ago, Dr. Carl Pribram, whom I teach with at Georgetown University, said in the 50s there was a scientist who actually took a salamander's brain and scrambled it and put it back in the skull, and within 2 weeks there were reconnections in the brain, and that salamander was functioning just fine. We're learning from this. We have so much to learn, and obviously it is important to us as humans in terms of our longevity and our quality of life. But more importantly than that, it is important to see how everything is connected, and of course all of your listeners know this already, but the way it's connected is still stunning and constantly amazing.
Well, and I think that's what's so beautiful about looking, again, I've mentioned a number of times the Sacred Society's work and the wisdom teachings in the native traditions is the reverence for life. And, though people might laugh when I say I would spend my time in the swimming pool saving bugs or ride my bike so as not to hit an ant, I mean, when you have that kind of sensitivity, the truth is you can't not be that way. I mean, I wish I could say it's a choice, but it's really not a choice for me. I feel like I came in with that awareness, and I feel that that's what's returning and needs to return to the earth, which is this sensitivity that all life does matter, and that anytime something is born or dies, the whole world is changed, as silly as that can sound, so that each of our efforts to preserve something and to elevate something in life is of benefit to the whole world. By the same token, Karen, though, it seems then, because you all have really opened the door and scientists are beginning to appreciate the animal kingdom, which you don't know this, but I've decided this is my next life work is animal communication, which is why I picked out your book. And this is after working in Kabbalah for almost a decade. I now want to move into animal communication because the inner guidance I'm getting is they are trying to teach us now about something that's really important about the changes on the earth.
Absolutely.
And how do we go about, in an orchestrated way, paying attention to them rather than just studying it?
Well, and that is our sensitivity, and when we walk out the door, I'm so glad you're doing this, and I'm not surprised. This is the time, and science is bringing us, in our culture for a lot of people, if science doesn't say it happens, it doesn't exist. Well, I figured in this book, you want science? I'll give you science.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've done a beautiful job.
It's there that we can look and see, and even more than we even imagined many times, the communication that's going on at every level, even at a quantum level, and where even science is starting to get a lot of things. The latest Scientific American, they talk about how, in fact, when the protons were in the collider in Geneva, when they were colliding, suddenly something changed, and there was a synchronizing that occurred. And the scientists are saying, how did this happen? What's going on? Well, the synchronization, the connection. And as you said, elevate. When people say, well, yes, so you're upending human nature. In fact, we're not the only intelligent ones. I said, I'm not lowering humans. I'm lifting us all.
Amen to that. Dr. Karen Shanor's work and her author. I want to encourage you all to read Jagmeet Kanwal and Karen Shanor's book, Bats Sing, Mice Giggle, The Surprising Science of Animals in Our Lives.